West Virginia, the United States of America. The state of West Virginia is one in which it is filled with both history and natural wonders, from the sprawling Appalachian Mountains to the Shenandoah River, and it is overall an outdoorsman's dream come true. Now, while what the average person knows about West Virginia might be solely from a John Denver song, many people aren't aware of the stories that come out of these deep wooded hills and mountains. Stories of monsters and aliens, and even one of the most famous cryptids of all time hails from the mountain state. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive into tales of folklore and legend, stories of the bizarre, and investigate and tell the stories of some of the most obscure creatures known to stalk the state, sometimes referred to almost heaven. Today, it's cryptids across America in the state of West Virginia. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic. And of course, it has been some time since I have done a cryptid episode in general, and I felt like today was a good time to revisit the little mini-series that I've been doing. And it has been quite some time since all the way back in Season 1 when I first did one of these episodes, so I felt like this was a perfect combo of circumstances to do this for this week's episode. Now for this week's episode, I decided to do the great state of West Virginia, and you may be asking yourself, why did I choose West Virginia of all places? And that is for a combination of reasons. Not only is West Virginia one of the most prolific areas of legend and folklore in the entire United States, but also contains the Appalachian Mountains, which themselves I could do a whole episode on, just in regards to their mysteriousness and the stories that come out of them. West Virginia has some high-profile cryptids and stories coming out of it, such as the stories of the Mothman, perhaps one of the most famous cryptids of all time. The Flatwoods Monster, that meshes the line between both cryptid, legend, and alien all in one story, and even the case of Indrid Cold, who might not be a cryptid necessarily, but his story is incredibly ominous and creepy itself. Now, I very well could have chosen those three just to lump together in this episode today, but I felt like that'd be too easy, and I felt like that'd be too kind of run-of-the-mill. And I also felt like those could be entire episodes in and of themselves, so I decided today that instead of that, I wanted to explore some of the lesser-known monsters and critters stemming from the state, all with their own kind of uniqueness and bizarreness that I'm really excited to share with you all. Now, on a different tangent, if anyone is fans of the Fallout game series like I am, and I'm a little bit of a gamer, I'm a little bit of a nerd like that, and you have happened to play Fallout 76, arguably not the best one in the series, but if you have played it a little bit, some of the names of these creatures might sound familiar, and that is because the game took a lot of these stories and applied them to the game. So, not gonna lie, that was also kind of part of my inspiration for doing West Virginia for this edition of Cryptids Across America. So if you happen to not know how today's episode is going to work, let me lay it all out for you, as it is a little different from my normal episodes. I'm going to go over each cryptid, the stories and legends behind them, weigh my personal thoughts and theories about what I think could be responsible for their sightings, and then move into the next cryptid, and so on and so forth. Now, the cryptids I am going to be covering in today's episode are going to be the Sheepsquatch, the Ogua, the Snarly Yow, the Grafton Monster, and Bat Boy. All of which sound very interesting, and all are very, very different from each other. But, with that being said, let's move into the meat of today's episode, and let's start with our first cryptid, the Sheepsquatch. The Sheepsquatch is a creature that is reportedly described as 4 times the size of your average bear, with white-colored fur, walks on 2 legs, has a pointed head similar to that of a dog, large teeth, and a set of horns protruding from its head. The idea of the beast having horns is hotly contested, as some reports only have the defining characteristics being that it has white fur. And other than the white fur, some people just say it kind of resembles very similarly to that of Bigfoot, just like a white Bigfoot, whereas some other accounts say it looks more like a sheep with the horns and everything. Kind of conflicting reports there. I kind of saw 2 sides of the aisle when I was doing my research on this. Some people claiming it was just white. That's really why they called it Sheepsquatch, because it was white like a sheep. And then other people said, oh no, it genuinely looks like a giant sheep monster. That's why it's called Sheepsquatch. So, I'm going to get into those as well here in a second, but I felt like I wanted to distinguish the 2 different descriptions of the Sheepsquatch before we dive a little deeper in here. Now, the reported sightings of the Sheepsquatch are pretty far-reaching, as Point Pleasant, which if you're not familiar with Point Pleasant, is the infamous sighting of the Mothman encounters, and even north of Point Pleasant towards the town of Rivesville. And those towns are approximately 3 hours apart from each other. So this creature has quite the range. The sightings are kind of all over the place, which makes it seem like it's very widespread. Maybe there is multiple of them. Maybe there's a growing population of them. Who knows? It's very interesting. Now, sightings of the Sheepsquatch seem to be concentrated in the following counties of Boone, Kanawha, Putnam, and Boone County, with a large chunk of sightings reported around the 1990s, and that kind of seems to be the bulk of when the sightings take place. However, the origin and original tale of the Sheepsquatch is quite interesting. Now, the first mention that we actually see regarding anything that we would think as a Sheepsquatch would be first mentioned in a book titled The Telltale Lilac Bush, which was written by Ruth Ann Musick in 1965. And this book was a collection of folklore tales from around West Virginia. Now, in this book, it does detail a sighting of the Sheepsquatch that we think of, but rather this kind of ginormous white beast that this woman encountered, what I assume was many decades ago before Musick wrote this book. Now, when traveling home from church, this woman was riding on horseback, and this first story describes it as like a strange white beast. It doesn't really describe it as a sheep. It describes it as, again, like a white Bigfoot, or a very large, white, hairy creature. It doesn't say it has horns. It doesn't say it has a pointed nose like a dog, or pointed nose like a sheep, or anything like that. It's basically just a white beast. Now, in this story, it describes a story about a woman who was riding home from church on horseback. And throughout this story, the author calls it the White Thing. The book calls it the White Thing. It does not call it the Sheepsquatch. And this White Thing nickname seems to have stuck with the creature to this day, as that kind of seems like, an additional moniker that it's gained, not just Sheepsquatch, but also being called the White Thing. Now, this initial sighting, I apologize for going back and forth here. This initial sighting in the Telltale Lilac Bush, or story, details this event where this woman is riding home from church on horseback, where she sees this monster on her way home. Now, she fled from this monster through the woods back to her home, and she left her horse outside, and she hid inside because she was shocked. She was scared to death of this giant white hairy animal that she just could not describe. And obviously she left her horse outside, ran inside, hunkered down for a short while, basically until the beast left. Now, after some time, this woman got the courage to look outside, and she saw that her horse had been killed, and actually some of its flesh had been consumed by this white thing, this monster. Now, West Virginia has a collection of mysterious white creatures that stalk the woods, and we will go into another one of those as well. But the Sheepsquatch, to me, doesn't seem like it's getting mistaken with anything else in the woods. It seems pretty distinct, and we'll go into another creature that's all white later, with that being the Grafton monster. And they are very distinct from each other. I just want to throw that out there. And when I was doing my research, again, there was a lot of these kind of white creatures that kept stalking up, like the white hair. It's just kind of weird, a weird correlation. I couldn't really figure out why that was, so I guess that's one of those mysteries. If anybody is done some research into the cryptids of West Virginia, and maybe there's like a deep-rooted reason as to why that is, please feel free to leave that for me in the comments. I'd love to hear it, but I couldn't find any information as to why that seems to be the case. Now, we have that initial story coming out of 1965, but it seems like we get a cluster of sightings in the 1990s and kind of some other assorted sightings as well, and I want to go over those now. Now, the first sighting that I was able to find was actually from 1929. Now, this sighting starts with a Croatian immigrant named Frank Kozel. Now, he went on his way home from work in Marion County, West Virginia, and Frank took a shortcut through the woods near the Jordan 93 mine, and this is where Frank would encounter a creature that he describes, and I quote, "Beast about the size of a large dog with white hair, a bushy tail, and sharp teeth." Now, Frank was able to escape this beast as it chased him, and he didn't suffer any injuries, but it clearly startled him. And keep in mind, This is another sighting where Frank doesn't mention anything about the creature looking like a sheep, or having sheep-like features such as the horns. Now, the next sighting that I could find would be jumping us all the way ahead to this little hotspot we have in the 1990s. In 1994, the first sighting would occur from a Navy seaman who said that he saw the beast as it moved through the forest. He said that he was able to observe the creature for a period of time as it knelt down by a creek and eventually approached a nearby roadway and slowly disappeared deeper into the forest. Later on in that same year, 2 children in Boone County observed the monster while outside playing. They described the beast as a large white bear, except it stood on its back legs. It did not notice the children at first, and when it did, it seemed to startle in the creature, who took back off into the woods, broke through the wood line, and as it ran through the woods, it seemed to break off medium-sized tree branches in its wake. So that means it's pretty considerable in terms of size if it's breaking off medium-sized tree branches off of trees. Now, fast forward to 1995 is when the Sheepsquatch would be spotted again. A couple driving through Boone County would have their own encounter with the beast when they saw it on the side of the road in a ditch. Not knowing what they had just seen when they drove past it, the couple stopped the car to get a closer look. They described the creature much like witnesses before, this time with what I assume is the white hair, horns, teeth, and overall sheep-like facial structure. However, when the car came to a stop, as they put it in reverse, backed it up to try and see, oh, what was that we just drove by? Sheepsquatch came out of the ditch and proceeded to attack their car. The couple sped off from the scene, and when they arrived home, they observed numerous large scratch marks from where the creature had attacked their car. In 1999, there was another sighting, and this time from a group of campers in the forests of Boone County. As they were sitting around the campfire at the end of the night, unwinding, they heard a rustling and snorting-like noises, similar to that of an aggravated bear. Now, they were kind of like, this is kind of weird, what's going on? Is there a bear? And before they could kind of collect their bearings, no pun intended, and see what was going on, Sheepsquatch emerged from the darkness and into their camp. The campers, who turns out to be camping in the woods just near the backyard of their home, I guess I wouldn't do that. Like, if, I guess, spirit of adventure and all that, let's go camp in our backyard for the night. I know people do that, but I don't know. Just seems weird to me. Again, if you do that, if you camp in your backyard, definitely not going to knock that against you. I personally wouldn't do that. I think I'd go camp somewhere else. It kind of takes the whole thing out of camping, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the campers left their belongings in the woods and ran straight home while being chased by the Sheepsquatch. Now, when they returned home, they observed the Sheepsquatch stop chasing them right at the edge of the tree line. It just stopped. And while it was sitting in the edge of the tree line, it let out a terrible scream. Now, when the campers returned to the campsite in the morning, they said that the camp was torn to shreds and the ground was torn up like, and I quote, like someone had tilled it for gardening. Now, this sighting to me sounds like a little bit cliche with the whole camping trope and a monster, but the scream at the tree line and then proceeding to destroy the campsite, I find very interesting because I just don't think that, if this was fake and if they made this up, why would they go through all the extent to tear up their own campsite? That to me doesn't make any sense, so I think it lends credibility to this particular sighting. Now, we take another time jump here to a sighting from more recent times, and this being from 2015. In Folks Run, Virginia, just a hop over the border from West Virginia, the creature would be spotted by campers for the second time. It was close to midnight when the campers would see something that they could not explain. They described Sheepsquatch as roughly 8 to 9 feet tall. One of the campers saw the creature first at the top of a hill overlooking their campsite. And how the story goes is when they tried to alert the other members of their camp, this is when Sheepsquatch came down the hill and started to chase the camper. This led them back to the other members of the camp, and some of them actually had to wade through a river to try and avoid being chased by the monster. And kind of during this whole hot pursuit, the campers described Sheepsquatch as starting to wade into the river to chase them when a loud scream was heard coming off from the distance. Now, the creature stopped and almost turned around back where he came from, which is kind of very interesting because that makes it sound like he was almost being called back by another creature, which again makes you ask the question, could Sheepsquatch be an isolated group of actual animals that are living in the forest? Kind of very interesting to think about. Now, the campers took this story to some trusted locals in the area, thinking that if they took this story to the cops, they would be ridiculed. And this, to me, isn't a great alibi because not reporting the case in general, even though the ridiculed thing, like not reporting it, to me, casts more doubt on the story than if you did. Because if you actually saw something, tell the right people that you did, and that you ain't crazy. But I guess, again, I have never been chased by a white sheep Bigfoot monster in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains either, so there's that. However, those were just some of the quick sightings that I was able to dig up in my research. And if you, as a listener, have done any independent research on Sheepsquatch or have found any other sightings, feel free to let me know about them. Instagram direct message. You can throw them down in the comment section. I do read comments all the time, so feel free to do that for me. I do greatly appreciate that. But with that being said, let's get into some theories for the Sheepsquatch and my personal thoughts. Now, honestly, a lot of things for me just don't add up. The fact that the original reports don't seem to mention the sheepish nature of the creature makes me believe that it didn't always used to be described that way, and maybe society influenced the stories and people started saying it looked more like a sheep strictly because of the name it was given. Secondly, a lot of these sightings I found don't give names, and to me that hurts credibility. Although the pattern of white monsters in West Virginia is very interesting, and I do think that this is a separate creature altogether, but with some people describing it as kind of similar in size to a bear makes me think that perhaps this could be some type of misidentified albino bear. Now, I did do a whole episode back on the Spectre moose that was most likely an albino moose in the deep forests of Maine, whose story was kind of slowly influenced and changed over time. Now, do I think that that necessarily is a smoking gun when it comes to Sheepsquatch? No, not at all. Because maybe this could be a subspecies of Bigfoot as well. You know, places in the United States all seem to have their own versions and stories in regards to kind of this local type of Bigfoot. Now, perhaps this could be a version of that. Maybe this is a white Bigfoot. It is a very definitely interesting and kind of curious to look into, and it kind of has me scratching my head because, in my mind, nothing really fully fits for the Sheepsquatch. But I do like the idea that this is some type of, localized version of Bigfoot. We have tales of like the skunk ape down in Florida, the grass man over in the Midwest. So we have those stories as well. So I think that rather than this being a kind of sheep Sasquatch hybrid with the horns and the sheep face, I'm more willing to believe that this is a subspecies of Bigfoot, if you want to believe that it's Bigfoot at all, that is just white in color. And that is how it got its name. It's white like a sheep. That's why it's called Sheepsquatch. It doesn't actually have horns. Kind of society gave it horns because it was called the Sheepsquatch. But with that being said, those are kind of my thoughts on the Sheepsquatch. I'm not going to dwell on it too much longer because now let's move into the Ogua. Now, to my knowledge, based on what I could find, even though the Ogua is spelt O-G-U-A, it is pronounced Ogua like A-Q-U-A, like Spanish for water, if that makes sense. Like it's O-G-U-A, but it's pronounced Ogua, if that makes sense, if you're following along with me. And I had to look it up when I saw this because I didn't want to pronounce it wrong. And the story of the Ogua is, quite frankly, cool. The Ogua was one of these. This is probably the coolest one I found out of all of these. It's probably my favorite just because of the uniqueness in the whole story, in the type of monster it is. It's very cool, and you're going to hear me geek out a little bit. Now, the story of the Ogua is rooted in the legend of this area. The Ogua is a river monster that is said to inhabit the Monongahela River. If I butchered that, I do apologize. I believe I did pronounce that right. And it's also in the tributaries connected to it in north-central West Virginia and southwest Pennsylvania. Now, the folklore regarding the beast starts with the Native American peoples who used to inhabit this area, mostly the Shawnee and the Delaware. They spoke of this river monster and gave it the name Ogua, which loosely translates to river demon or water devil. Now, what makes Ogua different than perhaps some other aquatic cryptids I have discussed on this show is that this isn't some type of plesiosaur or like dinosaur-like animal, but rather something closer in resemblance to a giant snapping turtle. Yes, a giant snapping turtle. And the stories about it describe it very consistently. It is described as being roughly 12 to 15 feet long, roughly 400 to 500 pounds, with rough scaly skin that ranges from a dark green to kind of this reddish brown color, And some accounts even describe a series of spike-like humps going down its back, which further this idea regarding this creature's kind of reptile, turtle, alligator-like cross of an appearance. Now, another feature that the beast is rumored to have is a long tail, almost the entire length of his body, which it uses much like a weapon to either attack boats and even help it swim through the water. Now, turtles do have tails, although I don't think the tails get to be their entire length of their body. Again, I'm not a biologist, so if anybody does have information on, I'd say, turtles and their anatomy, let me know in the comments about if turtles' tails can get the size of their body, because that is something I have zero experience in. My knowledge in turtles is very, very limited. Now, its head is very turtle-shaped, with people saying it ranges from the size of a beer keg to a small car, which is that's a very West Virginian type explanation, and it has very powerful jaws like a snapping turtle. Its eyes are often described as a yellowish red color, and the Ogua is often described also as extremely aggressive and territorial in nature, as it will attack virtually anything that it considers prey or a threat to its territory. For its size and mass, the Ogua is surprisingly quick and can surface and dive back into the water very quickly. It can make swift movements to attack prey and even lunge forward. Now that you have a good picture of the type of beast that we are working with, let's get into some sightings of the creature, and they are quite numerous. Of course, we start with the native peoples of this area that said they have seen this creature for generations and know that it dwells within the Monongahela. As European settlers moved into the area in the 1700s, they too began to hear stories and have sightings of the creature. They heard rumors about the native peoples not wanting to paddle to certain spots of the river out of fear that they might become the creature's next target. The earliest documented sighting that I could find comes from 1745 in Holt, West Virginia. According to this story, a 12-year-old boy was fishing along the riverbank of the Monongahela with his family when, out of the blue, the Ogua appeared and snatched the boy from the bank. They were described as enormous and turtle-like, and Ogua would take this boy off the bank and take him into the water where he would never be seen again. Our next reported sighting comes from the late 1700s, the date I couldn't fully kind of find narrowed down, and it actually came from a soldier stationed at Fort Harmar near present-day Marietta, Ohio. Now, this soldier detailed this creature in a letter in which he describes this quote-unquote river devil that would ambush deer downstream from certain watering holes on the river. He goes on to detail in this letter that a group of soldiers actually managed to kill one of these Oguas, which they measured at over 15 feet long, and tipping the scales at 400 plus pounds. Now, that's not all though. The soldier would go on to write about the discovery of this creature having two heads as well, which of course I think would help exaggerate the legend a little, I think. As the river valley around the Monongahela would industrialize in the early 1900s, the legends that people heard started to seem like they were true. As more people moved into this area, they all kept seeing something that they couldn't explain. In 1983, a series of sightings would take place near Rhymesville. Of course, this would be the place that would also have a Sheepsquatch sighting too, so I guess there's just something in the water up in Rhymesville. There were a few sightings, however. The most notable was from a coal miner named John Edward White. He would see the creature while out fishing one night and would describe seeing its head and tail surface along the water before slowly diving back down into the river's depths. It seems like the stories continued into the 90s, and even in 2003, a rumored photograph was floated around Pittsburgh from a fisherman. However, this photo was way too blurry to even get a good idea or a good picture of the creature, or even what the photo contained. It was just so blurry. Now, I was not able to find this picture while doing my research. So with that being said, what the heck do I think this thing is? Well, I personally think this thing is real, but perhaps not in the way that you might think it is. Now, alligator snapping turtles can grow to huge sizes, with the largest on record being 211 pounds and caught in Texas. However, in captivity, we have seen them tip the scales at over 250 pounds, even though that would only be half the size of what is being recorded here with Ogua. We have also heard instances of rogue alligators being found way outside of their natural habitat within the southeast and somehow being able to traverse the waterways of this portion of the U.S. to make their way up to West Virginia. We've also seen pet alligators be released into the wild in present times, and some of them being very, very large. Now, I do think that it is possible that the stories could be a combo of both. Perhaps the modern day sightings, and maybe from the 1970s onward, could be influenced by the presence of discarded pet alligators, or perhaps a massive alligator snapping turtle, but just not to the size of what's being described with the Ogua. Now, we also know a turtle species named the archelon that lived 70 million years ago did get to be 15 feet long. However, that was strictly a sea turtle and not a snapping turtle that is described here. After all, the Ogua can traverse both water and land and was described as having legs, which makes me think that it's my first statement that this is some type of either giant snapping turtle or some kind of alligator holdouts. And back in the 1700s or 1800s, they really didn't know what they were looking at, so they thought this was a giant turtle, or it looked like a turtle when it was really an alligator. Now, with that being said, that's kind of what I think in terms of the Ogua. But let's move into our third cryptid of the day, and that is the Snarly Yow. Now, the story of the Snarly Yow seems to bear a lot of resemblance to other dog-like cryptids from around the globe. However, the Snarly Yow seems to tether on the edge of cryptid, but also on the paranormal world, as it is described as it can often appear and disappear almost in a cloud of smoke, that it is black or gray in its fur and coloring, and is incredibly fast, as it is rumored that the Snarly Yow can keep up with a horse at full gallop. Now, you might be wondering, why is it called the Snarly Yow? And kind of the legend goes is that the reason it's called the Snarly Yow is because that's what it sounds like when it kind of howls or when it kind of barks, is that it's this kind of snarly, or what it sounds like, almost like if you were to howl when you push, your tongue up against your teeth, it seems muffled. And that's what they report the creature sounding like. So they're like, oh, it makes a Snarly Yow, so I guess that's what we're going to call it. I guess points for originality, I guess. Now, he also seems, if it is a he, the Snarly Yow seems to bear a striking resemblance to the Black Shuck, which is another dog ghost-like creature from all the way over in the UK. Now, the range of this mysterious dog ghost is throughout West Virginia and into Maryland. However, from what I could find, the Snarly Yow seems to exist mostly in urban legend and folklore, mostly starting from the German settlers who originally moved into West Virginia and the surrounding area. The root of the sightings seem to date back to 1790 from an inn near South Mountain, Maryland. Now, although these sightings were not in West Virginia specifically, they were written down and documented in a book in 1882 written by Madeline Vinton Dahlgren called South Mountain Magic. Now, one of these sightings of the Snarly Yow was documented as the following. One night, about 10 o'clock, as he was returning from the village of Boonesboro, whither he had gone to make some little purchases for his family, he encountered the black dog. It was clear starlight, and the ungainly form of the beast could be distinctly traced. It was black, and bigger than any dog he had ever seen, and, as he came nearer, the object intercepted him, and stood guarding the road in such a way as to forbid his crossing. So, to use his own expression, he fit him, that is, nothing daunted, he fought at him. But, to his confusion, as the creature was attacked, it grew longer, and presently seeming to extend across the road, making no noise, but showing a very wide and very ugly-looking red mouth, while all the time the thick and heavy blows rained down upon it. The sinewy arm of the woodsman met with no resistance, but rather seemed to beat the air. Presently the still lengthening shadow passed onward, and then the man, not a little flurried at the strange sight of the vision, went home. Nor did he receive the least bodily harm from this ominous combat. Now, of course, that is like old-timey, kind of broken English, but you kind of get the picture here that he fought this giant black dog in the middle of the road and was defending himself, and the dog was basically a ghost, and that he was beating smoke and air, which is kind of interesting and kind of cool. Like, if there was like a smoke dog that was just kind of like on the road, and you're like, all right, I got to defend myself because this dog's huge and it looks like it's going to attack me, and then you realize that you're just beating air. I'd feel like I was going crazy, like if I saw something like that. So, it's kind of a cool story. Now, this account seems very paranormal in nature rather than cryptid, but again, it seems very much like the black dogs of English folklore. Now, could it be possible that this is, in fact, what this is? I mean, it would make kind of sense that during the 1700s and 1800s, that legends like this could have made their way to the Americas as more European settlers of all types moved into the New World. Black dogs in English folklore that include the Black Shuck, like I just mentioned, were rumored to be harbingers of bad luck, or guardians of the underworld. Now, whether or not these black dogs, or the Snarly Yow for that matter, exist in the real world remains to be seen. Now, what do I think the Snarly Yow could be? I mean, I think it has a really cool story. Even though it doesn't fully separate itself from its British counterparts, I very much like the idea that the Snarly Yow could be a wolf. Now, even though wolves don't live in West Virginia anymore, during the 1800s, they did, and bounties were set up for people who did kill them. Perhaps a black wolf in particular could be responsible here, and maybe the English or German or other European settlers thought that this could be a version of the black dogs talked about in legend and folklore back in Europe. I like my personal thoughts on this one, especially since, in my quick little research, I couldn't find any modern-day sightings. Well, that being said, let's move into the Grafton Monster. Now, the Grafton Monster is one I have heard of before prior to doing this episode, and in my eyes, it's truly a one of one, because I have never heard of another creature described like this, and I think its uniqueness, if I was grading these on a scale anyways, would help put it above the others. The Grafton Monster is described as a massive white figure, with its height being roughly 7 to 9 feet tall, with white seal-like skin, 2 arms and legs, and get this, headless. So it is uncertain how this beast was able to see without a head, or maybe perhaps it had eyes in its torso. Nobody really knows. However, that remains unknown. The story of the Grafton Monster seems reserved to a single story that has inspired its appearance in pop culture, and even having a festival named after it. The best piece of evidence, and arguably the only credible sighting that we have of the Grafton Monster, is by a man named Robert Cockrell, who had his encounter on June 16th, 1964. Cockrell was driving home from work and was driving on Riverside Drive right past Grafton High School. This road also goes past the Tigard River. Cockrell said that he saw a large white obstruction, that's a quote from him, that was standing in a clearing beside the road. He said, of course, it had this rough, almost seal-like skin and no visual head, like I mentioned previously. As Cockrell drove past the creature, it did not move, but rather remained perfectly still. Obviously, this shook Cockrell to the core, and once he got home, he got in touch with 2 of his friends to try and go back to the spot of the initial sighting to try and see it again. However, they had no luck, as the creature seemingly vanished and was no longer in the area. However, when they did return to this area, they didn't find any footprints, but what they did find was a large impression left behind in the dirt and the grass from where the creature was standing, which pretty much confirms that there was something there. What was there remains in question. While Cockrell and his 2 friends searched the area to try and figure out where the creature went to, they all reported hearing a low whistling noise, seemingly coming from the river, although they couldn't find the source of the noise. The story of the Grafton Monster spread throughout the county as people took to the woods to try and catch a glimpse of this monster, but no one had any luck. Cockrell was a reporter for the Grafton Sentinel newspaper, and he wanted to publish a story on what he saw. However, he was quickly shot down by the editors, who thought there was no way in hell that this story was even believable. However, more unconfirmed sightings started to come in, mostly from local college kids, which, I guess, take that as may, how reliable you think local college kids are, but that's neither here nor there. But because of these additional sightings, it prompted the newspaper to then run a story on the monster, and then the police and other authorities quickly dismissed these claims of a creature lurking in the woods of Grafton, West Virginia. And to this day, no physical evidence has ever been presented for the creature's existence, but now, this year, 60 years after Cockrell's original sighting, the Grafton Monster Festival will be taking place on Father's Day weekend, and it did take place on Father's Day weekend this past June, and judging on this article that I found stating this, it looked like thousands of people were planning on attending, which sounds like quite the party. But with that being said, with the brief and albeit infamous encounter that people talk about in West Virginia, is there any credibility to this story? And what do I think could be personally responsible for the Grafton Monster? Personally, I find it tough to believe, because the one singular confirmed sighting by Cockrell is pretty much all we have. And sure, it is rumored that some college kids saw it, but I couldn't find any dates or names to seemingly line up with that. I think it is possible that Cockrell saw something, but a giant white headless creature that makes whistling noises? I just don't know. It seems a little far-fetched, as much as I want to believe it. It also seems, from what I could find, that Cockrell didn't make a huge stir about this, as he just wanted to publish the story. So I'm thinking that maybe having this encounter, or making something up about this encounter, would draw attention to his articles, and maybe get him some more recognition and status as a reporter, and hopefully some type of financial incentive. As much as I want to believe this one singular sighting makes me doubt that this creature is even real. even though this creature is in a category entirely of its own in terms of cryptids and just getting so infamous off of one sighting, and I think that's strictly because of how weird in nature the cryptid is described. Now, our very last one is a short one, and it's kind of goofy, and this last one is Bat Boy, and I could have left it out of this episode, but I felt like it was kind of ridiculous and funny, and I wanted to get a good laugh, so I decided to throw it in here at the very end of today's episode. Now, Bat Boy isn't really a cryptid, but rather an urban legend created by the media. The legend of Bat Boy first appeared in a 1991 issue of Weekly World News, which for a long time was one of those supermarket magazines that you would see on the end of the checkout line with these crazy headlines that really didn't make much sense. They are infamous for creating fictional headlines made to get people to buy the magazine. And as of late, they're actually making a little bit of a resurgence. They were popular from like 1979, I believe, to roughly about 2007. And then, as kind of technology advanced, people just stopped buying magazines like they used to. And I mean, you walk down the supermarket aisles now, you see like the crazy headlines. It could be like, oh, King Charles had an affair or whatever. I made that up. But they'd use those giant headlines that you couldn't help but notice, and they'd make ridiculous claims. This was one of those magazines. And it was completely fictional. Most of all the stories were either completely fake or at least 80% fake. And in this article about Bat Boy, it tells this story about a young boy who was seemingly discovered deep underground in a cave in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia. It is rumored that he is half man, half bat. He has these big ears that allow him to hear over a huge radius. And he was raised in one of these caves by bats, and he escaped out into the real world and has become this type of pop culture figure. Now, numerous continuations of the story have him being captured and escaping numerous times. They have him influencing culturally significant events, and even showing up in an episode of The Simpsons. Now, of course, Bat Boy is insanely not real, but it is an interesting example of how far the media can take a story and run it well past its due. Of course, I could have left this one out, like I said, but I felt like it was goofy and funny, and I wanted to share it with you all. Of course, there are other cryptids that I did not mention that have called West Virginia their home, such as Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster, and Ingrid Cold, like I mentioned in the open. And each of those have enough substance to be their own episodes, so I will be adding those to the queue and eventually doing one eventually. Especially Mothman. I like to, hopefully in the future, do a whole deep dive on Mothman, do a huge long episode for you guys, and really uncover everything that I can in terms of Mothman, because there are other creatures like Mothman that are out there as well that I want to throw in when I eventually do my Mothman episode. So stay tuned for that. I will be covering all of those in the future. But until then, I hope you appreciated this little deep dive into West Virginia lore and legend, and learned about some monsters that might still be lurking in the mountains, rivers, and shadows of the Mountain State. With that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed our Welcome Back into the Cryptids Across America series. And if you happen to be listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, you can also follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown and TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown. You can follow me both there. I will be posting custom cover art to each week's episode on my Instagram. On TikTok, I do little 1-minute breakdowns of each episodes, trying to just extend my reach and my audience and to more people who like this type of content. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the second entry of Cryptids Across America. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next one.